Think about this for a moment. What would it feel like to pour decades of your life into raising children, 8 of them, and then one day wake up and realize you are nothing more than a shadow in their lives? Imagine being the man who worked through sickness, who sacrificed his youth, who buried his own dreams just so his family could stand tall, and then, in your old age, being treated like a burden. That is not just my story. It is the story of countless parents who gave everything and were left with nothing. And the hardest part? It doesn't happen all at once. It comes little by little, in the forgotten phone calls, the dismissive glances, the whispers about you being too old, until one day you look around and realize the very people you lived for have erased you. But I want you to stay with me, because what happened next in my life will shock you. And it carries a lesson about respect, sacrifice, and family that every son, every daughter, and every parent needs to hear. This is not just about betrayal, it is about what happens when the tables turn and the forgotten father reveals the truth no one saw coming. This story I'm about to share with you isn't just about me. It's about every father, every mother, every parent who has ever given their all and wondered if their children even noticed. It's about betrayal. It's about pain. But it's also about something greater: what happens when a forgotten parent decides to stand up and do something that changes everything. So sit with me a while, because if you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever felt like your sacrifices were invisible, this story is going to touch a part of you that you've kept quiet for a long time. But before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Are you in California, Texas, New York, or somewhere else? I'd love to know. And don't forget, if you believe parents deserve respect, go ahead and subscribe, because these are the kinds of stories we need to share. You see, to understand why that silence on my 75th birthday cut so deep, you need to know where I came from and the life I lived. I wasn't born with much. In fact, I came from a home where money was always short, but love was never in question. I learned early that dignity doesn't come from the size of your wallet. It comes from how you carry yourself when the world tries to break you. When I was a young man, I met a woman who lit up every room she walked into. She had a laugh that could calm storms and eyes that carried more kindness than words ever could. She was my partner, my anchor, my strength. We married young, and together, we dreamed of a big family. Not riches, not luxury, but a home filled with laughter, respect, and faith. And we got that, for a time. But life has a way of rewriting your plans. When she passed away, suddenly and far too young, I was left standing alone with 8 children looking up at me. I remember that night, their little faces filled with fear, and me trying to swallow my own grief because they needed me more than I needed to cry. I buried my pain, and I picked up my duty. From that day, I wasn't just their father. I had to become both father and mother. The years that followed were hard. I took every job I could find: construction during the day, janitorial shifts at night, odd jobs on weekends. There were times I came home with my hands bleeding, my back screaming, but I still had to stand in the kitchen and cook dinner, because no matter how tired I was, I wouldn't let my children go hungry. Sleep became a luxury. Rest became a stranger. My body broke down piece by piece, but my spirit stayed focused on one thing: raising my children right. Teaching them that respect matters more than riches, that honesty will take you further than shortcuts, and that family is the only treasure worth protecting. And I wasn't perfect, but I tried. I taught them how to pray before bed. I showed them the importance of telling the truth, even when it hurt. I took them to church every Sunday, not because I was forcing them into faith, but because I wanted them to know there was something greater than themselves, something to hold on to when the world turned cruel. You know, people often ask me, why didn't you remarry? Why didn't you look for someone to help share the burden? And the truth is, I couldn't. My promise to my wife, made on her deathbed, was that I would raise our children with all the love we dreamed of together. I wasn't going to bring another person into that picture. My duty was to them. My whole life became about them. And it wasn't easy. There were times I sold things. I cherished my wedding band, my tools, even the watch my father left me just so I could pay for school supplies or keep the lights on. There were winters where I wore the same torn coat for years because I bought jackets for them instead. I never dreamed of being rich. My dream was much simpler. I wanted children who would grow up to love one another, to love God, and to understand that sacrifice is the backbone of family. I wanted respect. Not gifts, not glory, just respect. I thought if I gave them everything, they would carry those lessons forever. I thought the seed I planted in their hearts would grow into honor. But life, it doesn't always turn out the way we imagine, does it? As the years passed and my children grew older, the house changed. The sound of crying babies turned into the chatter of teenagers, and then into the footsteps of young adults chasing their own lives. On the surface, I should have felt proud. 8 children, healthy, educated, moving into the world. But inside, I started noticing something I never thought I would see: distance. It began small, the way most changes do. One child forgetting to say thank you when I gave them money for gas. Another rolling their eyes when I asked for a little help around the house. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself, they're just young. They'll grow out of it. But what I didn't realize then was that these little cracks were slowly growing into something deeper. I had one son in particular who always seemed to believe he was smarter than me. He would interrupt me at the table, correct the way I spoke, laugh when I told stories about my struggles. Once, I shared how I used to walk miles to work because we couldn't afford a car back then, and he smirked and said, "That's because you didn't know how to make real money, Dad." His words stung, but I stayed quiet. A father sometimes swallows his pain just to keep peace in the home. My daughters were kinder, but even with them, the shift was there. They started missing family dinners, choosing outings with friends instead. They still called me Dad, but it felt less warm, less rooted in gratitude, more out of habit. It's a strange thing, watching the love you poured into your children slowly be taken for granted. The hardest part was the way they treated one another. I raised them to respect family, but I watched arguments over small things grow into cold silences that lasted for months. Money, possessions, who did more chores, who deserved more freedom, little battles that made me wonder if all the lessons I fought to teach them were slipping away. And yet, I never stopped giving. If one of them needed rent money, I found a way to send it. If another needed babysitting, I took their children into my home without question. If someone wanted to borrow my truck, I handed them the keys. I kept believing that one day, all that giving would circle back into respect. But slowly, I began to feel something I never thought I'd feel as a father. Invisible. My words mattered less. My advice was brushed aside, and my sacrifices became expected instead of appreciated. They started to talk about me as though I were already in the past. Dad doesn't understand the world today. Dad's too old-fashioned. I was alive, working, still carrying them in every prayer I whispered at night, and yet, in their eyes, I was fading. I never complained out loud. I just kept moving forward, because that's what fathers do. But deep inside, I felt a quiet storm, growing a storm made of questions, doubts, and a pain that no one seemed to notice. And I didn't know it then, but that storm would soon collide with the moment that changed everything. The moment that broke me didn't come like a storm you can see in the distance. It came quiet, disguised as just another day. And then, it ripped away the little dignity I still held on to. It began with talk among my children about the family home. The same house where I raised them, where their mother's voice once filled the kitchen, where every wall held memories of laughter and tears. To me, that home was sacred. To them, it became something else, an asset, a piece of property to manage and divide. I remember sitting in the living room when one of my sons spoke sharply. "Dad, you're too old to handle the paperwork, too old to keep up with things. We'll take care of it from here." His words sounded like help, but his tone carried something different. It wasn't love, it was dismissal. Soon after, they arranged a meeting not at our dinner table, but in a courthouse. I walked in wearing the same suit I had worn to their graduations, hoping that if I looked presentable, they'd see I was still the same father who once carried them on his back. But the air in that room told me otherwise. I wasn't treated as the man who had raised them. I was treated like a burden standing in the way of their plans. I sat there as papers slid across the table, full of words I didn't fully understand. Legal terms, property rights, signatures. And I watched my children lean in together, whispering, nodding, pressing pens to paper as though I wasn't even there. One son looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, this is for the best. You can't keep up with everything anymore. Do you know what it feels like to hear your own child declare you unfit? It doesn't just sting. It cuts through the years of sacrifice like a blade." In that moment, I wasn't the father who raised them, the man who worked 3 jobs to buy them shoes, the man who stayed up through the night when they were sick. In that moment, I was just an old man they had already written off. The judge's gavel came down, the papers were stamped, and with it, my home, my pride, slipped from my hands. They told me I could still live there for now, but the words felt hollow, because it wasn't mine anymore. They had taken it, signed it away, and all I could do was sit in silence while the world I built was stripped down to ink and signatures. I walked out of that courthouse that day, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. The sun was shining, people were laughing on the sidewalks. Life moved on as though nothing had happened. But inside, I felt hollow, empty. I had never begged for much in my life, but that day, I found myself begging God for answers, and that was the turning point. The moment when the weight of betrayal settled so heavily on my chest, I could hardly breathe. The very children I had sacrificed everything for had taken the one thing I thought they would never touch, my dignity. And from that day forward, everything began to change. After that day in the courthouse, my life did not feel like my own anymore. I still woke up in the same bed, in the same house, but something inside me had shifted. Every creak of the floorboards, every photo on the walls, every chair around the table, all of it reminded me of what I had lost. Not just a house, but ownership of my life. It is a strange kind of suffering. To live in the home you built with your bare hands, and yet feel like a guest inside of it. The children came and went, making decisions about repairs, about furniture, about bills, and they rarely asked me. Sometimes I would find out things after the fact, like when my son rented out part of the farmland without even telling me. I stood at the window one morning and saw strangers plowing soil that I had once bled into. That was when the weight of it all began to crush me. Financially, I was already stretched thin. I had no savings to boast of. Every cent I ever earned had gone into raising those kids, into their schooling, their meals, their futures. Now, without control of my property, I had almost nothing. I lived off a small pension, just enough to cover basic food and medicine, but not enough for the dignity of independence. For the first time in my life, I had to ask for help, and there is no pain quite like asking your children for the very things you once provided for them. Emotionally, I carried a loneliness heavier than I can explain. Even when the house was noisy with grandchildren running through the hallways, I felt unseen. I would sit in the corner chair and watch them play, but nobody asked for my stories anymore. Nobody asked me to lead the prayer at dinner. I had gone from being the pillar of the family to a shadow in the room. At night, sleep became a battle. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying my life like an old film. I remembered the long nights I walked home from work with holes in my shoes, the days I skipped meals so my children could eat, the hours I sat beside their sick beds, whispering prayers. And now here I was, with nothing to show for it but silence and distance. Even outside the home, I felt the sting. Neighbors who once respected me now looked at me with pity. Some said, "Your children are successful now. You should be proud." But they didn't know the truth. Success means nothing when it comes with disrespect. Relatives stopped visiting, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of gossip. I don't know which was worse. Socially, I became smaller. Conversations passed me by, decisions ignored me, and gradually I began to feel invisible, as though my age had erased me. And the worst part? My children didn't even notice the change. They thought I was just quiet, but inside, I was breaking. Every day became a struggle between holding on and giving up. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that they would come around, but the reality grew harder to deny. The very family I sacrificed everything for had left me standing on the outside of my own life. And it was in those silent nights, when the weight felt unbearable, that I began to ask myself the questions no parent ever wants to ask. Was it worth it? Did I raise them wrong? Did I give too much? Or maybe, did I give everything and leave nothing for myself? That was the storm I lived in. A storm not of thunder and rain, but of silence, loneliness, and questions with no answers. In those quiet nights, when the house was still and the world outside had gone to sleep, that was when my heart spoke the loudest. I would lie there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, and my mind would take me back through every chapter of my life. I remembered the first day I held each of my children, the tiny fingers wrapping around my thumb, the cries that filled the room, the way I whispered promises into their ears, promises that I would never abandon them, never stop loving them, never let them feel the hunger and cold I once knew as a child. Those promises became the compass of my entire life. But now, decades later, I asked myself, what do you do when the promises you kept don't seem to matter anymore? I thought about the sacrifices no one ever saw, the times I worked myself sick, coughing through the night but still showing up at dawn because bills don't wait. The evenings I skipped meals, pretending I wasn't hungry, just so there was enough food on the table for my children. The mornings I woke up with aches so sharp I could barely move, yet I pushed through because their needs came before my comfort. And I thought about love the way I poured it out in actions, not just words. The way I stitched torn clothes by hand, packed lunches with notes of encouragement, and sat through school plays clapping louder than anyone else. I was there. Always there. Not perfect, but present. And isn't that what children need most? A father who shows up? So then why, after all of that, did I feel like a ghost in their lives? Why did their voices grow cold, their eyes turn away, their hearts drift further with every passing year? I asked myself questions that cut deep. Maybe I raised them too comfortably. Maybe by giving them everything, I taught them nothing about struggle. Maybe I should have let them feel hunger once or twice, so they'd know the value of food. Maybe I should have said no more often, so they'd learn the worth of sacrifice. It is a painful thing, looking back and wondering if your love was your biggest mistake. I also reflected on the man I had become. Once, I was strong, confident, the rock of my home. Now, I was frail, dependent, and overlooked. I questioned my own worth. I asked God if my life still carried meaning. I searched for answers in prayer, sometimes whispering through tears, sometimes shouting into the emptiness of my room. And yet, deep down, there was a voice that reminded me. Sacrifice is never wasted. Even when unrecognized, even when forgotten, sacrifice shapes the soul of the giver. My children may not honor me, but that didn't erase the truth of what I had done. I had given my life to love, and no amount of betrayal could take that away from me. Still, the pain remained. I longed for a simple thank you, a hand on my shoulder, a phone call just to say, "Dad, I love you." But instead, I had silence. Silence that echoed louder than any words could. And in that silence, I began to realize something important, that maybe this story of mine was not just about betrayal. Maybe it was about finding strength in the very place where I felt weakest. Because sometimes, when everything you gave seems forgotten, that is when you discover the hidden parts of yourself that no one can take away. That realization was only beginning to take shape. When pain sits heavy in your heart, you think you're carrying it alone. But the truth is, people notice. They may not always speak it out loud, but their eyes tell you they see the cracks. Neighbors who once greeted me with respect began to greet me differently. It wasn't the same firm handshake or cheerful "Good morning, sir." No, it was a softer tone, the kind people use when they feel sorry for you. They tilted their heads, forced smiles, and said things like, "How are you holding up?" I nodded and told them I was fine. But deep down, their pity cut deeper than their silence. Because pity is the opposite of honor. In church, the place where I once sat tall in the pews with all 8 of my children around me, I now sat alone. Families that once admired us whispered among themselves. I could hear their murmurs when they thought I wasn't listening. He raised all those kids by himself. And now look, not one of them cares for him. They meant no harm, but every word felt like salt on an open wound. Relatives noticed too. Some stayed away altogether, uncomfortable with the shame that hung over my house. Others came around only to deliver advice I never asked for. They'd say things like, "You should have been stricter," or "You spoiled them too much," as if the years of sacrifice could be reduced to a single mistake, as if they had walked in my shoes. Even in the grocery store, I felt it. The cashier would ask politely, "Will your family be joining you tonight?" I'd smile and say, "No, just me," pretending it was by choice. But the truth pressed against my chest. Like a stone, I was a father of many, yet I shopped like a man who lived for one. And when word spread about the house, how my own children had taken it over, I became a topic in hushed conversations. Some said, "It's shameful." Others said, "That's how kids are these days." But very few looked me in the eyes anymore. Respect had been replaced by stories, by whispers, by pity. That was the hardest part of all. It wasn't just the betrayal inside my own walls. It was how that betrayal followed me outside. How it changed the way the world looked at me. I had once been the man people admired, the widower who raised 8 children alone. Now, I was the man they whispered about, the father who gave everything and was left with nothing. And yet, even as the world around me shifted, I told myself to stay silent, to endure it. Because a father's pride is not in how loudly he defends himself, but in how patiently he bears the weight of what life throws at him. But what I didn't know then was that silence has a breaking point. And soon, the quiet suffering inside me would turn into a fire I could no longer hide. What began as whispers and quiet dismissals soon turned into something louder, something I could no longer ignore. The disrespect that once hid behind polite words now walked boldly into the open. It started with the land. The same soil I had tilled with my own hands. The same fields where I taught my sons how to work a plow, how to plant seeds, how to respect the earth. One morning, I looked out the window and saw strangers working that land. Not neighbors lending a hand, not family carrying tradition, but men I had never met. My son had rented it out without even asking me. He pocketed the money, while I stood there with nothing but memories of what that soil had once meant. To them, it was just acreage. To me, it was the story of my life. Then came the gatherings. Family events that used to be filled with warmth turned into stages for my humiliation. I'd offer advice, and one of them would laugh under their breath. I'd try to tell a story from the past, and another would interrupt saying, "Dad, that's old news. Nobody cares about those days anymore." They didn't realize that those old days were the very foundation of everything they now enjoyed. Worse still, some of them began to speak about me in public, as if I weren't even in the room. At a family dinner, I overheard one of my sons telling his cousin, "Dad doesn't understand how things work anymore. We'll handle it." I sat there in silence, spoon in hand, pretending not to hear. But inside, I felt myself shrinking, piece by piece. The humiliation didn't stop within family walls. Word reached the community. People began asking me about decisions I had never made. "I hear your son is selling part of the property." Or, "I hear the land's been leased for years now." I nodded politely, but each question reminded me of how little say I had in the legacy I worked so hard to build. Even finances became another battlefield. Whenever I needed the smallest thing, medicine, a repair, even a ride to the doctor, it was treated like a burden. We'll see if we have time. We'll get to it later. These were the children I once carried on my back through storms. And now, my needs felt like an inconvenience, too heavy for them to bear. The weight of it all pressed hard on my chest. The land, the home, the gatherings, the finances, every part of my life that once gave me strength was now being used to strip me of dignity. I was no longer seen as the father, the guide, the rock of the family. I had become a background figure in the very story I had written with my own blood and sweat. And yet, I stayed quiet. Because what is a father to do? Argue? Demand? That was not the way I was raised. A father endures. A father absorbs the blows so his children can stand taller. That's what I believed, until I realized those very blows were no longer shaping them. They were breaking me. That was the moment I began to see this wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was betrayal. And betrayal, when it comes from the hands you once held as a child, cuts deeper than any enemy ever could. And while I remained silent on the outside, inside, something was starting to stir. A voice telling me that this could not go on forever. For a long time, I told myself a father's job was simply to endure, to swallow the hurt, to let the children grow as they wished, even if it meant carrying disrespect in silence. But silence has a weight, and one day, it presses so heavy that it forces you to look in the mirror and ask, who am I now? That day came for me one morning as I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection. My hair had thinned, my back had curved. My hands trembled from years of labor. But my eyes, those tired old eyes, still carried something my children had forgotten. Strength. The kind of strength that comes from survival, from sacrifice, from walking through fire and still standing. And for the first time in years, I spoke to myself out loud. I may have been forgotten, but I am not finished. That was the beginning of my turning point. I started by reclaiming something small, my dignity. When they mocked my stories, I didn't stay silent anymore. I told them, these are not just stories. These are the roots of your life. Without these moments, you wouldn't be here. Some rolled their eyes, but others stayed quiet. And I saw in their faces that a seed had been planted. I also began to move differently. Instead of waiting for them to ask if I needed something, I started doing what I could for myself. Walking instead of asking for rides. Fixing what I could with my own two hands, even if it took me all day. It wasn't about pride. It was about showing them that age had not erased me. And most importantly, I turned back to the one place I had always found strength, my faith. Every morning, I prayed not for wealth, not for revenge, but for clarity. I asked God to remind me who I was beyond being a father. Because sometimes we forget that parents are people too, with lives, with worth, with dignity, apart from what our children give us. Slowly, I began to feel a fire return inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, but resolve. Resolve to stop letting their choices define the man I had become. Resolve to hold on to the truth, that I was more than the disrespect I endured. And in that fire, a thought grew stronger. My children believed they had taken everything from me, but they were wrong. They took the surface, the papers, the land, the decisions, but they never touched the foundation. The foundation I had quietly protected, the part of my legacy they didn't even know about. And as I realized that truth, the shame I once carried began to transform into strength. The same silence that once broke me now became my shield. Because while they thought I had been defeated, I was quietly preparing for the day when they would learn just how wrong they were. That day was coming. I could feel it. Life has a way of teaching lessons that no parent's voice can deliver. You can ignore wisdom. You can laugh at sacrifice. You can take what was never yours to take. But eventually, life holds up a mirror. And that mirror spares no one. For my son, the one who had been loudest in dismissing me, the cracks began to show. At first, he walked with pride, puffed chest, telling everyone how he now handled the property, how he made the decisions his old father could no longer make. He carried himself as though he had won some sort of victory. But victories built on disrespect don't last long. His business ventures began to fail. Deals he bragged about collapsed before they even began. He borrowed money from friends, promising returns that never came. Slowly, the same community that once whispered about me started whispering about him. He talks big, but he can't deliver. At home, his marriage began to crack under the weight of pride and poor choices. His wife, tired of the arrogance and the constant money problems, pulled away. Arguments filled the walls that were once quiet. And while I never wished pain upon him, I could see clearly the same disrespect he had shown me was creeping into his own home. The cycle was beginning to repeat. Even with his siblings, the respect he once demanded started to fade. They questioned his decisions. Some accused him of keeping more than his share of the money from the land. Others stopped answering his calls. The unity they once had in pushing me aside was now fracturing, and I watched silently as the same pride that tore them from me began tearing them from each other. But perhaps the most telling consequence was the way people looked at him in the community. The same neighbors who once pitied me now began to distance themselves from him. Opportunities closed. Respect slipped away. He was left standing in the very shadow he had tried to push me into. And here's the truth: I never celebrated his downfall. A father's heart doesn't find joy in a child's pain, no matter how much hurt that child has caused. Instead, I felt a deep sadness. Because I knew his troubles were not accidents. They were the fruit of choices rooted in arrogance and disrespect. Choices I warned him about. Choices he refused to hear. Life has its own justice. You can outrun many things, but you cannot outrun dishonor. Eventually, it circles back. And as I watched my son stumble through the consequences of his pride, I realized something important. Sometimes, a father's silence teaches more than his words ever could. And while he was facing the weight of his own choices, I was quietly preparing for something greater. Because even in my old age, I still carried a truth none of them had seen yet. A truth that would change everything when the time came. While my children believed they had stripped me of everything, the truth was, they only touched the surface of what I had built. What they didn't know, what I had never spoken out loud, was that long before they started fighting over papers and property, I had quietly secured the very heart of my legacy. Years earlier, after their mother passed, I made a promise to myself. No matter what life took from me, I would protect at least one piece of our foundation. Something untouchable, something that would never leave our name. And so I held on to the homestead, the small but precious plot of land where my wife and I first dreamed of raising our family. Most people didn't even remember it existed. It wasn't as large as the farmland they fought over. It wasn't as profitable, and it didn't sit in the center of town where everyone could see it. But to me, it was priceless. It was the ground we laid our first bricks on, the soil where my wife planted her first flowers, the place where our children once ran barefoot in the summer evenings. That land carried more memory than money could ever buy. Quietly, I placed it in the care of an old friend, a lawyer who had stood by me for decades. The papers were signed, sealed, and hidden away long before my children thought to look. While they were busy claiming victory in a courthouse, I already knew that the greatest treasure was safe beyond their reach. But my plan wasn't just about land. My plan was about patience. I let them believe they had control. I let them boast, let them laugh, let them treat me as though I was powerless. I endured the humiliation because I knew something they didn't that time reveals truth. And silence is often the strongest shield. I also began to write. In the late hours of the night, when sleep would not come, I filled notebook after notebook with the story of my life, the struggles, the sacrifices, the lessons I had learned. I wrote letters to each of my children, letters they had not yet seen, each one carrying the words I could never bring myself to say face to face. Not words of anger, but words of truth, of love, of warning. I knew there would come a day when they would need to read them. And slowly, I realized my hidden plan wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about shaming them. It was about reminding them of who I was, of what I had built, of the fact that respect is not measured in property or money, but in the honor you give to those who carried you when you were too small to stand on your own. I waited, patiently, quietly, watching them build their castles on sand, while I held the rock they had forgotten. And deep down, I knew the day of revelation would come. A day when all the arrogance, all the betrayal, all the pride would meet the truth they never expected. And when that day came, it would not be me who proved them wrong. It would be life itself. The day of revelation did not come with thunder or shouting. It came quietly, just like the betrayal had. It was during a family meeting one they had called, not me. I was invited almost out of obligation, as though my presence was more formality than necessity. They gathered around the long table, speaking in quick, sharp tones about money, property, and who was managing what. To them, I was just an old man sitting in the corner, listening. But they didn't realize I had been waiting for this moment. They argued about debts, about who had covered which bill, who had invested in what, and who deserved a larger portion when the land was sold. Their voices grew louder, their faces red with pride, and for a long while I stayed silent. I let them speak over one another, each one fighting for a bigger piece of something they had not even built. Then, when the noise reached its peak, I cleared my throat. The room grew still. Slowly, they turned toward me, some impatient, others almost amused, as if expecting another old story they could brush aside. But this time was different. I placed a folder on the table, worn but carefully kept. Inside were the documents I had guarded for years, the papers, proving that the homestead, the original foundation of our family, was mine, alone. It had never been signed away. It had never been touched by their hands. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the piece of land your mother and I built our lives on. And while you thought you had taken everything, you forgot this. You forgot the beginning. And the beginning still belongs to me." Silence. No whispers, no laughter, no interruptions. Just silence. I looked at each of them, grown men and women now. But in that moment, I saw them as the children they once were, wide-eyed, caught in the truth. I told them plainly, "You believed I had nothing left. You believed I was powerless, that age had stolen my voice. But I never stopped being your father. And a father does not measure his worth in the papers you stamp or the titles you claim. My worth has always been greater than what you see." The shock on their faces was not anger, it was realization. Realization that the man they thought they had outgrown still held the deepest root of the family tree. They had been fighting over branches while forgetting the soil from which it all came. One of my sons finally spoke, his voice low, almost trembling. "Why didn't you tell us?" And I answered, "Because respect should not depend on what a man owns. Respect should come from who he is, from what he has given, from the love he has carried, without asking for anything in return. I let you show me who you really are when you thought I had nothing, and now you know the truth, that I was never empty." The room stayed quiet. Eyes shifted down, hands fidgeted, pride deflated. For the first time in years, the weight of silence belonged to them, not to me. And in that moment, The balance shifted. I was no longer the shadow in the room. I was the foundation they had overlooked, the strength they had underestimated. The revelation was not about land alone. It was about dignity, about reminding them and myself that while age may take your body and betrayal may wound your heart, truth has a way of standing taller than both. That day, everything changed. Not because I shouted, not because I fought, but because I simply revealed what had been there all along. After I placed those papers on the table and spoke my truth, the silence in the room became heavy. For years, I had been the one sitting in silence, swallowing humiliation, carrying hurt that no one wanted to see. But that night, the silence belonged to them. I looked at their faces, my children, my blood, grown men and women. Yet in that moment, I saw flashes of their childhoods. The boy who once held my hand crossing the street. The girl who used to fall asleep on my chest after crying. The child who begged me to come watch their school play. Those same children now sat before me, unable to meet my eyes. Finally, one of my sons, the one who had pushed hardest against me, broke the silence. His voice cracked as he said, "Dad, why didn't you tell us you still had the homestead? Why did you let us believe you had nothing?" I leaned forward, my hands shaking but my voice steady. Because I wanted to see who you were when you thought I had nothing. Because respect, real respect, cannot be bought or forced. It is shown when a man is at his lowest, not when he is at his highest. And what I saw broke my heart. Another child spoke up, tears welling in her eyes. "We thought we were helping. We thought you couldn't handle things anymore." I nodded slowly. Helping does not look like taking. Helping does not sound like mocking. Helping does not strip dignity from the one who carried you when you were too weak to stand. What you did was not help. It was betrayal, wrapped in excuses. My words cut through the air, not in anger, but in truth. And sometimes, truth is sharper than any blade. One by one, they tried to speak excuses, apologies, explanations. But I raised my hand. No, this is not the time for excuses. This is the time to listen. For once, you will listen. I told them about the nights I worked myself to exhaustion so they could sleep in warm beds. I told them about the meals I skipped, the clothes I never bought for myself, the dreams I buried so theirs could live. I reminded them of the promises I made to their mother and how I gave everything I had to keep those promises alive. And then I looked each of them in the eye and asked, "Tell me, when did I become invisible to you? When did your father's worth shrink to the papers on a table and the money in his pocket? When did respect die in this family?" No one answered. Because deep down, they knew the answer already. It wasn't one moment, one choice. It was a slow drifting, a gradual forgetting of the values I had tried so hard to plant in their hearts. Tears fell down faces that had once been proud. Some hung their heads in shame. Others whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." But apologies spoken in the heat of confrontation do not erase years of silence. They are only the beginning. And yet in that moment, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel revenge. I felt sorrow. Sorrow that it had taken so much pain for them to finally see me. Sorrow that my love had been weighed, measured, and nearly forgotten before truth forced its way into the room. But I also felt something else. Strength. The strength of knowing I had spoken what needed to be spoken, carried what needed to be carried, and stood not as a broken old man, but as the father I had always been. That night, the confrontation did not end with shouting. It ended with silence, but a different kind of silence. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of hearts finally confronted with truth. And in that silence, I saw the beginning of something I had thought was lost forever. The possibility of change. After that night of confrontation, nothing in our family was the same again. Truth, once spoken, does not return to silence. It lingers. It lives in the corners of every conversation, in the pauses between words, in the heavy weight of eyes that no longer meet as quickly as before. Some of my children took the truth to heart. They came to me quietly in the days that followed, not with grand speeches, but with small actions. One daughter began visiting more often, bringing meals not because I asked, but because she remembered how many meals I had placed in front of her when she was a child. Another son started repairing things around the house without waiting to be told. Little gestures, but each one whispered, "We see you now. We remember." But not all of them changed. Pride is a hard master, and some hearts take longer to soften. A few still carried their arrogance, though now it was quieter, more guarded. They no longer boasted openly, but in their eyes I could see the struggle, the fight between guilt and pride. And I understood. Because repentance is not a single word. It is a journey. As for the son who had led the charge against me, his justice came not from my hands, but from life itself. The same pride that made him dismiss me began to close doors in his own world. Business deals failed one after another. The respect he once demanded from his siblings evaporated. Even the community, which once listened to his big plans, started shaking their heads, saying, "He talks too much and listens too little." I did not rejoice in his downfall. A father's heart cannot celebrate the pain of his child, even when that pain is deserved. Instead, I felt the weight of it, because I knew the root of his troubles was not money or failure. It was dishonor. And dishonor is a seed that poisons everything it touches. But justice is not only about consequences. It is also about restoration. Slowly, the family gatherings began to change. There was less boasting, less arguing. They began asking for my prayers again before meals, something they had neglected for years. And when they asked, I gave it freely, because that is what fathers do. Even when wounded, a father's love does not withhold blessing. I did not punish them. I did not seek revenge. The revelation itself had been enough. The natural order was restored, not by force, but by truth. They began to understand that no matter how successful they became, no matter how modern the world grew, the foundation of their lives still rested on the sacrifices of an old man who refused to give up on them. And I found peace, not because everything was perfect, but because dignity had returned. I was no longer invisible. My voice, once dismissed, now carried weight again, not because I demanded it, but because truth demanded it. Justice had come not through courts or contracts, but through the unshakable law of life. Disrespect may rise for a season, but honor will always stand at the end. In the quiet that followed, I found myself thinking less about the pain and more about the lesson. Age has a way of turning wounds into wisdom, if you allow it. And after everything I had endured, the silence on my birthday, the betrayal in the courthouse, the humiliation at the table, the revelation that restored my dignity, one truth rose above it all. Respect is the true inheritance. You can hand down land, money, houses, and gold, but none of it will hold a family together if respect is missing. Without respect, blessings turn to curses, and wealth turns to ashes. But with respect, even the smallest home becomes a palace. Even the poorest table becomes a feast. I raised 8 children with my bare hands and a broken heart after losing their mother. I gave them everything I could. Not riches, not luxuries, but love, protection, sacrifice, and faith. I thought that was enough. And in some ways, it was. But what I learned is that no matter how much you give, your children must choose whether to honor it. That choice is theirs alone. And to you, listening to my story now, I want you to remember this. Do not measure your worth as a parent by how much your children own, or even by how much they say. Measure it by what you poured into them, by the love you gave when no one was watching, by the sacrifices you made in silence, by the prayers you whispered when they never even knew. Those things do not vanish, even if the world overlooks them. They are written in heaven. and they are written in the souls of your children, whether they recognize it or not. But I also want to leave a word for the children who might hear this. Never forget the hands that raised you. Never forget the feet that walked miles so you wouldn't have to. Never forget the nights your parents went without so you could have more. Because one day, the roles will reverse. One day, you will be old, and you will long for the same respect you once gave or refused to give. Plant honor now, so that you may reap it later. In the end, I did not need riches. I did not need applause. All I ever needed was to know that my life mattered, that my sacrifices were not wasted, and that the name of Father was still spoken with honor. That is the true reward of a parent's life. And that, my friend, is the wisdom I carry after 75 years of walking this road. Respect, humility, family. Without those, nothing lasts. With them, even the smallest life shines with meaning. As I sit here now, looking back on the road behind me, I realize something I wish I had understood sooner. A father's life is not measured by applause or by how loudly the world thanks him. A father's life is measured by the love he gave, even when it cost him everything. I have known what it means to be forgotten. I have tasted the bitterness of silence, the sting of betrayal, the ache of sitting at a birthday table alone. But I have also known what it means to stand, to endure, and to rise with dignity even when others try to take it away. And here is the truth I want to leave with you. People may strip you of possessions. They may mock your age. They may forget your sacrifices, but they can never erase who you are. They can never take away the years of love you gave, the nights you stayed awake for your children, the prayers you whispered into the dark. Those things are eternal. If you are a parent, hear me. Your worth is not defined by how your children treat you in one season of their lives. Your worth is written in the sacrifices you carried, in the lessons you passed down, in the values you planted. And if you are a child listening, hear this: honor your parents while you still can. Because the day will come when the chair they once sat in will be empty, and no amount of regret will bring them back. In my 75 years, I have lost much, but I've also gained something unshakable. The knowledge that respect and love are the only true legacies worth leaving behind. Everything else fades. So if you remember nothing else from my story, remember this line. A parent's greatest treasure is not what they own, but the honor their children give them. And when honor is gone, everything else loses its meaning. That is the final truth I carry with me. Now, my friend, I've spoken my truth, but I know I am not the only one with a story like this. Somewhere out there, maybe even you listening right now, has lived through something similar. A sacrifice unseen, a love forgotten, a respect withheld, and I want to hear from you. Tell me your story. Have you ever given everything, only to feel invisible in the very home you built? Have you ever carried a burden in silence, because the ones you carried it for did not see it? Or maybe you are on the other side of it. Maybe you've watched a parent give their all, and you now carry the weight of knowing you could have shown them more love, more time, more honor. Share it with me. Don't hold it back, because these are the lessons we need to pass on, not just to heal ourselves, but to teach the next generation what truly matters. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Are you in California? Texas? New York? Are you in Florida? Georgia? Illinois? Or somewhere far beyond? It matters to me because it reminds me that this wisdom, these stories, they reach hearts all across the world. And maybe, just maybe, they can plant seeds of respect in homes that need it most. If this story has touched you, I ask one thing: don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, because somewhere there's a parent sitting at a table alone tonight, wondering if their sacrifices meant anything. Maybe hearing these words will remind them that they are not forgotten, that their worth is greater than the silence around them. And if you are a child watching this, I ask you to do something simple but powerful. Pick up the phone, Call your father. Call your mother. Don't wait for a holiday. Don't wait for a birthday. Call them now while you still have the chance. Because one day, the chance will be gone, and you will wish for just one more conversation. I'll leave you with this. Respect is not a grand gesture. It is in the small things, the listening ear, the gentle word, the visit when no one else comes. Those are the treasures that outlast everything else. So tell me, what's your story? Share it in the comments below. Let us learn from each other. Let us remind the world that parents deserve honor. And if you believe that too, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from California, Texas, Florida, New York, or anywhere else across this world. Because the more we speak these truths, the further they will travel, and the stronger families will become. Thank you for listening. May this story touch not just your mind, but your heart. And may it remind you respect for parents is not just tradition. It is the foundation of every family that hopes to last.